The scent of rosemary and garlic should have been comforting, but tonight it felt like a funeral shroud settling over Marlene's shoulders. She had been forgotten again. After 18 hours in this kitchen, her calloused hands trembling as she plated the final course for guests who would never know her name, she realized the crushing truth. She was nothing more than expensive furniture in Richard Lennox's world. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're preparing dinner for someone who won't even thank you, or washing dishes while everyone else sleeps. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise, today's story will touch your heart. The fog rolled across San Francisco Bay that October morning in 2018, creeping through the windows of the Lennox penthouse like fingers reaching for something lost. Marlene Rodriguez stood at the kitchen island, her weathered hands kneading sourdough starter she had been nurturing for 3 years, longer than some marriages lasted in this neighborhood. The marble countertop was cold beneath her palms, a constant reminder of the sterile perfection that surrounded her daily life. Richard Lennox's fortune, built on cryptocurrency investments and tech startup acquisitions, had purchased every luxury imaginable. Sub-zero refrigerators that hummed with robotic precision, a wine cellar worth more than most people's homes, and kitchen appliances that cost more than Marlene's annual salary. Yet for all the millions of dollars invested in this culinary temple, the space felt as hollow as an empty church. The morning light caught the crystal stemware arranged in perfect rows, each piece more valuable than the rent on her small apartment in the Sunset District. Marlene had learned not to touch them unless absolutely necessary. The last time she had reached for a Baccarat wine glass, Vanessa Lennox had sighed dramatically and muttered something about greasy fingerprints on heirloom crystal. The memory still stung like a paper cut that refused to heal. She could hear Richard's voice echoing from his home office, barking instructions into his Bluetooth headset about stock portfolios and dividend yields. His net worth had doubled in the past year alone, according to the Forbes article he had framed in his study. Bitcoin had been particularly generous to him, transforming digital numbers into real-world dominance. Yet despite all his financial success, despite the gilt-edged securities and offshore accounts, Richard Lennox ate his breakfast every morning with the mechanical efficiency of a man consuming fuel rather than food. Marlene had been cooking for the Lennox family for 6 years now, ever since Isabella Lennox, Richard's wife, had decided their household needed authentic flavor beyond the molecular gastronomy exhibitions their previous celebrity chef had provided. Isabella wanted someone who could create comfort, not just cuisine. Someone who understood that food could be a bridge between hearts, not merely a performance for Instagram followers. Those early days seemed like a different lifetime now. Isabella had still been alive then, her laughter filling the corners of this vast penthouse like sunlight streaming through cathedral windows. She had appreciated Marlene's simple genius, the way she could transform humble ingredients into something that spoke directly to the soul. Isabella understood that the best meals were love letters written in seasoning and steam. But Isabella had been gone for 3 years now, claimed by cancer that moved through her body like fog consuming the city. With her passing, the warmth had drained from the Lennox household like water from a broken vessel. Richard retreated into his work, his investments, his cold pursuit of financial growth. Vanessa, their daughter, became sharper, more brittle, as if her mother's softness had been the only thing keeping her humanity intact. The kitchen had become Marlene's exile and her sanctuary simultaneously. Here, surrounded by the tools of her trade, she could still create magic. Her arsenal included cast-iron skillets seasoned with decades of use, wooden spoons worn smooth by countless stirrings, and a collection of ceramic bowls she had brought from home, simple vessels that held more soul than all of Richard's expensive equipment combined. Every morning she arrived at dawn, taking the 38 bus from her neighborhood where Spanish conversations floated from corner markets and the smell of fresh tortillas competed with coffee from local roasters. The Sunset District was her real home, where Mrs. Chen from next door would share vegetables from her garden and where children played in streets that remembered their names. But her days belonged to this gleaming tower, this monument to wealth that somehow felt poorer than the modest house where she had learned to cook at her grandmother's elbow. Abuela's ghost seemed to hover in the steam rising from Marlene's pots. "Mia," she could almost hear the old woman whisper, "cooking is prayer. Every meal is a chance to give love to the world." But what happened when that love fell on deaf ears? When it was consumed without gratitude, discarded like expensive wrapping paper after Christmas morning? The penthouse kitchen was a contradiction in steel and stone. Richard had spared no expense when designing it. German engineering met Italian craftsmanship with appliances that could have equipped a small restaurant. The commercial grade range could produce flames hot enough to sear a perfect steak, while the steam oven could cook vegetables with scientific precision. There was a dedicated pasta station, a temperature-controlled wine storage system, and even a smoke chamber for curing meats. Yet despite all this technological mastery, the space felt dead. It was the absence of photographs that struck Marlene most deeply. In her own tiny kitchen at home, every surface displayed memories: her nephew's graduation picture, her late husband Miguel's military portrait, snapshots of family gatherings where food was the center of celebration. But here, the walls were bare except for abstract art that cost more than cars but conveyed no emotion whatsoever. The kitchen was beautiful and lifeless, like a museum display of wealth. This morning followed the same ritual as every other. Marlene prepared Richard's breakfast: steel-cut oats with locally sourced honey, free-range eggs from chickens that lived better than most people, artisanal coffee beans that cost $40 per pound. She arranged everything on bone china that was older than she was, carrying the tray to the dining room where Richard sat scrolling through market reports on his tablet. He barely glanced up as she set the meal before him. No acknowledgement, no thank you. Just the soft tap of his fingers against the screen, calculating profits while consuming the fruits of her labor. His attention remained focused on cryptocurrency fluctuations and quarterly earnings reports, numbers that danced across the screen like prayer flags in an electronic wind. In his world, everything had a price, a value that could be quantified and traded, everything except the love that Marlene poured into each meal. She had learned to move through the penthouse like a ghost, invisible unless needed. Her soft-soled shoes made no sound on the Italian marble floors. She had mastered the art of anticipating needs before they were spoken, of being present without being noticed. It was a skill born of necessity and practiced through countless small humiliations. The guests would arrive tonight for Richard's monthly dinner party. Tech executives and venture capitalists who measured success in stock options and IPO profits. They would devour her food while discussing investments in companies she had never heard of, washing down her carefully prepared dishes with wine that cost more per bottle than she earned in a week. But not one of them would think to compliment the chef. To them, good food simply appeared, like room service in an expensive hotel. As Marlene began preparations for the evening's menu, her hands moved with the muscle memory of decades. She could julienne vegetables blindfolded, could tell the doneness of meat by the sound of its sizzle, could balance flavors with the intuition of a composer writing symphonies in salt and acid. These were skills that couldn't be taught in culinary schools or purchased with Richard's Bitcoin fortune. They were the inheritance of generations of women who had fed their families with love and improvisation. But skill without recognition was like singing in an empty theater. Beautiful, perhaps, but ultimately heartbreaking. The morning light grew stronger, burning off the San Francisco fog and revealing the city spread below like a glittering circuit board. From this height, Marlene could see the Mission District where she had grown up, where her mother still lived in the same small house, tending a garden that produced more flavor in one tomato than this entire penthouse seemed to contain. She could see the Castro, the Haight, neighborhoods where people lived with passion and community, where a good meal was cause for celebration rather than mere fuel for the next business transaction. In 6 hours, this kitchen would be filled with the sounds and smells of her artistry. Steam would rise from pots like prayers ascending. Aromas would dance through the air like invisible celebrations. Colors would bloom on plates like flowers after rain. But none of the diners would see her. None would think to ask her name or thank her for the love she ladled onto their plates. Marlene Rodriguez, invisible artist of the kitchen, began another day of pouring her heart into food for people who had everything except the wisdom to taste the love in what she created. Tonight, like every night, she would feed the wealthy while starving for the simplest human acknowledgement, to be seen, to be valued, to matter in a world that had reduced her to the shadow of a shadow. The fog continued to lift outside, but inside the Lennox penthouse, the emotional morning mist lingered, cold and penetrating, touching everything except the hearts that needed it most. When Marlene first walked through the towering glass doors of the Lennox penthouse 6 years ago, she carried nothing more than a small canvas bag filled with her grandmother's handwritten recipes and a heart full of hope. The domestic agency had warned her about the exacting standards of wealthy clients, about the invisible boundaries that must never be crossed, about the need to remain professionally distant. What they hadn't warned her about was how slowly a person could disappear while standing in plain sight. Isabella Lennox had interviewed her personally, a rarity in a household where most staff were hired through intermediaries and background checks. She was a woman who still possessed warmth despite years of marriage to San Francisco's tech royalty, someone who understood that money could buy ingredients, but not the soul that transformed them into nourishment. Isabella had tested Marlene not with questions about culinary technique, but with a simple request. Cook me something that tastes like home. Marlene had prepared arroz con pollo that afternoon, using Isabella's pristine kitchen like a foreign language she was learning to speak. The dish was nothing fancy. Saffron rice studded with tender chicken, peas bright as emeralds, sofrito that filled the house with the scent of her childhood. But when Isabella took her first bite, her eyes had filled with tears that spoke of longing for something money couldn't purchase, the feeling of being truly cared for. "You understand," Isabella had whispered, and those 2 words became the foundation of 6 years of invisible service. In the beginning, Marlene had still believed that excellence would eventually merit recognition. She arrived each morning at 5:30, taking 3 buses from her Sunset District apartment to reach the Financial District towers before the family woke. Her day began with coffee preparation, not the simple drip coffee of her childhood, but complex espresso drinks that required equipment worth more than her car. She learned to operate machines that looked like spacecraft consoles, mastering the precise timing and temperature that would produce the perfect crema Richard demanded in his cortado. Isabella had been different from her husband and daughter in ways that mattered. She noticed when Marlene stayed late to prepare special birthday meals, when she researched obscure ingredients for Richard's business dinners, when she quietly orchestrated the household's nutritional needs around their individual health requirements. Isabella saw the artistry in Marlene's knife work, the way she could French a rack of lamb with surgically precise cuts, the gentle touch that could coax maximum flavor from the most expensive ingredients Richard's portfolio could afford. Those early years sparkled with small moments of connection. Isabella would sometimes sit at the kitchen counter while Marlene cooked, sharing stories about her childhood in Marin County, about the garden her mother had kept, about recipes she wished she had learned before it was too late. In return, Marlene shared carefully chosen memories of her own family, her grandmother's Sunday tamales, the way her mother could stretch a single chicken into dinner for 8 children, the festival foods that marked the seasons of her youth in the mission. "Food is the only universal language," Isabella had observed one afternoon while Marlene prepared gazpacho for a summer luncheon. "It speaks directly to memory, to comfort, to love. That's why your cooking matters more than any of Richard's investments." But even Isabella's appreciation came with boundaries that Marlene learned through careful observation. She was welcome to share conversation while cooking, but never to join the family for meals. She could receive compliments on her dishes, but only from Isabella, never in front of guests who might find it inappropriate for the help to be acknowledged. She could prepare elaborate celebrations for birthdays and anniversaries, but must remain invisible during the actual revelry. Richard treated Marlene like sophisticated room service from the beginning. He left written instructions about meal preferences, dietary restrictions, and timing requirements, but rarely spoke to her directly. When he did address her, it was with the distant courtesy one might show a hotel concierge, polite but fundamentally impersonal. His wealth had insulated him from the necessity of forming relationships with service providers. After all, staff could be replaced with a phone call and sufficient payment. His cryptocurrency fortune had exploded during those early years of Marlene's employment. Bitcoin surged from thousands to tens of thousands of dollars per unit, transforming Richard's early investments into generational wealth. Stock market returns, real estate portfolios, and venture capital stakes created money that grew faster than he could spend it. Yet despite this avalanche of financial success, Richard seemed increasingly isolated, speaking more often to his financial advisors than to his own family. Vanessa had been 17 when Marlene started working for the family, a sharp-tongued teenager who treated all household staff as background noise in her own dramatic narrative. Even then, she possessed her father's talent for dismissing people who couldn't advance her social standing. She would order elaborate meals for her friends, then complain loudly about the help when Marlene couldn't read her mind about last-minute dietary preferences or impossible timing demands. But the worst part of those early years wasn't the family's indifference. It was watching Isabella slowly fade away. The cancer began as fatigue that rich nutrition couldn't cure, progressed to appetite loss that even Marlene's most tempting dishes couldn't overcome, and finally settled into the kind of consuming illness that transforms restaurants and grocery stores into battlegrounds where every bite represents victory over death. Marlene had fought alongside Isabella during those final 18 months, researching anti-inflammatory ingredients, preparing bland but nutritious broths, seeking out organic vegetables and grass-fed proteins that might somehow tip the scales in favor of life. She learned to cook for someone whose body was forgetting how to want food, how to make tiny portions look abundant, how to hide medicine in smoothies that tasted like celebration rather than treatment. The last meal Isabella ever ate had been Marlene's tres leches cake, a dessert she had perfected over years of patient experimentation. The cake was light as cumulus clouds, soaked in 3 different milks until it achieved a texture somewhere between solid and dream. Isabella had managed 3 small bites before her body refused more, but her smile had been radiant with gratitude. "This tastes like love," she had whispered, and those were among the last words she spoke to Marlene. After Isabella's funeral, the penthouse became a mausoleum of marble and stainless steel. Richard threw himself into his investments with renewed vigor, as if stock portfolios and cryptocurrency wallets could fill the void in his chest. His dinner parties became more frequent, but less joyful. Networking events disguised as social gatherings were conversations centered on IPO opportunities and market volatility rather than human connection. Vanessa transformed from merely dismissive to actively cruel. Without her mother's softening influence, she began treating Marlene like an unwelcome reminder of loss rather than the person who had tenderly cared for Isabella until the end. Complaints became constant. The food was too spicy, too bland, too sophisticated, too simple. Nothing Marlene prepared met Vanessa's impossible standards, standards that seemed designed more to inflict pain than achieve culinary satisfaction. The kitchen that had once buzzed with Isabella's laughter became Marlene's solitary kingdom. She would arrive each morning to silence, broken only by the hum of expensive appliances and the distant sound of Richard's business calls. The space was beautiful and deadly quiet, like a cathedral where all the worshippers had lost their faith. Yet Marlene persevered, driven by something deeper than employment necessity. Isabella's death had somehow consecrated her role in this household. She became the keeper of food memories, the one who remembered which dishes had made Isabella smile, which flavors had sparked conversations between mother and daughter, which meals had created the precious few moments when the Lennox family had felt like a family rather than separate individuals sharing an address. Every morning, she prepared breakfast with the same care Isabella had witnessed and appreciated. Every evening, she created dinners that honored both the family's refined tastes and her own cultural heritage. She maintained the standards Isabella had valued: fresh ingredients sourced from local farmers, techniques that honored the natural flavors rather than overwhelming them, presentation that pleased the eye without sacrificing substance. But appreciation died with Isabella, leaving Marlene to labor in an emotional vacuum where 6 years of dedicated service had earned her nothing more than the right to continue serving. She had become part of the penthouse infrastructure, as essential and invisible as the heating system or the Wi-Fi network that enabled Richard's electronic fortune to grow, while his capacity for human warmth withered like fruit left too long in expensive crystal bowls. The daily humiliations began as pinpricks and evolved into systematic erosion of dignity. Each morning brought fresh evidence that Marlene's presence was tolerated rather than valued, that her artistry was consumed but never celebrated, that her years of faithful service had earned her nothing more than the privilege of enduring another day of being professionally invisible. Richard's cryptocurrency empire had made him bolder in his dismissiveness. Success measured in digital millions seemed to justify treating actual humans like expensive appliances. He would stride into the kitchen during her prep work, barking instructions while scrolling through his phone, never quite looking directly at her face. "The salmon last night was overcooked," he might announce while checking Bitcoin prices. And whatever that sauce was, it was too complex. Keep it simple. Anyone can make complicated food. The phrase, "anyone can make," became his favorite weapon of casual cruelty. Anyone can make risotto. Anyone can roast vegetables. Anyone can prepare pasta. As if the years she had spent perfecting these techniques, understanding the subtle differences between good and extraordinary, learning to read doneness by sound and smell and intuition, were skills that could be randomly downloaded like his trading apps. Vanessa had inherited her father's talent for inflicting small wounds with surgical precision. She would bring friends to the penthouse for dinners that showcased the family's wealth, elaborate 7-course meals that took Marlene days to plan and hours to execute, then spend the evening loudly wondering why the help couldn't prepare something more normal, like pizza or takeout Chinese. Her friends would giggle at Marlene's accent, make jokes about illegal immigrants cooking their food, and suggest that Richard could probably find someone better through one of those expensive staffing agencies. The worst part wasn't the words themselves, but the way Richard never corrected his daughter's behavior, never acknowledged that Marlene was standing 3 feet away from these conversations, never seemed to consider that she might possess human feelings capable of being damaged by their casual cruelty. His silence felt more violent than Vanessa's active hostility. During dinner parties, Marlene became a ghost haunting her own kitchen. She would spend entire days preparing elaborate meals for Richard's business associates, tech entrepreneurs whose startup valuations exceeded small nations' annual budgets, venture capitalists who spoke about disrupting industries while consuming food prepared using techniques unchanged for centuries. They would devour her creations while discussing blockchain technology and cryptocurrency trends, washing down her carefully balanced flavors with wines that cost more than most people's monthly rent. But not once, not in 6 years of dinner parties, had any guest complimented the chef. Not once had Richard thought to introduce her when complimented on the meal. She had become the invisible woman, her artistry attributed to caterers or the household's excellent kitchen facilities, rather than the human being who had poured skill and care into every dish. The kitchen itself seemed to conspire in her invisibility. Richard had designed it with a service entrance that allowed staff to move food without being seen by guests. Hidden panels concealed the working areas where actual cooking happened, preserving the illusion that elaborate meals simply materialized through the household's efficient systems rather than through human labor and love. The design was brilliant and dehumanizing, creating a space where artistry could be practiced but never acknowledged. Even the grocery shopping became a source of humiliation. Richard insisted on organic produce, grass-fed meats, artisanal cheeses, and other premium ingredients that reflected his wealthy status while maximizing his family's nutrition. But he questioned every expense, scrutinized every receipt, and made Marlene justify purchases as if she were a teenager asking for allowance rather than a professional managing the household's nutritional needs. $70 for olive oil? He had demanded one Tuesday morning, waving a receipt like evidence of criminal misconduct. What makes this oil so special? Does it cure cancer? Does it increase my portfolio returns? His sarcasm was acid poured over Marlene's careful explanations about flavor profiles and smoke points. To Richard, expensive ingredients were investments that should deliver measurable returns, not expressions of care that enhance the daily experience of being alive. The isolation was perhaps worse than the active hostility. Marlene ate her own meals alone in the kitchen, sitting on a stool tucked between the commercial dishwasher and the storage pantry. Her lunch was inevitably leftovers, not because the family was stingy, but because Richard had made it clear that preparing separate meals for the help was an inefficient use of resources. She learned to save portions from dinner preparations, creating her own small feasts from the abundance she prepared for others. Sometimes she would catch glimpses of the life she might have had in different circumstances. When Richard's business associates brought their wives to dinner parties, she could overhear conversations about book clubs and yoga classes, about children's achievements and vacation plans, about the ordinary intimacies of lives lived in community rather than isolation. These women existed in the same city, but inhabited a completely different universe, one where meals were shared rather than served, where cooks were friends and family rather than invisible staff. The hours grew longer as Richard's social ambitions expanded. Breakfast had to be ready by 6:30 each morning. Lunch was often last-minute decision for Richard's business meetings. Dinner parties regularly extended past midnight, meaning Marlene wouldn't finish cleanup until nearly 2 a.m., only to return 6 hours later to begin again. Her own life, her small apartment with its cheerful yellow kitchen, her elderly mother who lived alone in the mission, her nephew's baseball games and birthday parties, became abbreviated footnotes squeezed between her obligations to the Lennox household. The paycheck was generous by service industry standards, but it came attached to emotional chains that grew heavier each month. Every deposit into her bank account felt like payment for pieces of her dignity, compensation for accepting treatment that no amount of money should purchase. Yet, she needed the income. Her mother's medical expenses, her own modest rent, the small contributions she made to her nephew's college fund, these necessities kept her tethered to a situation that was slowly eroding her sense of self-worth. By the 4th year of Isabella's absence, Marlene had perfected the art of invisible tears. She could dice onions while crying from heartbreak rather than chemical irritation, could sauté vegetables while salt water seasoned her cheeks, could plate elaborate presentations while her vision blurred with accumulated sadness. The kitchen became her confessional, the only space where she could express the emotions that professional necessity required her to suppress. But somewhere beneath the daily indignities, beneath the casual cruelty and systematic invisibility, Marlene's pride continued to burn like a pilot light that refused to be extinguished. She might be treated like an expensive appliance, but she knew the truth about her own worth. Every perfectly seasoned sauce, every tender piece of meat, every vegetable cooked to ideal doneness was testimony to skills that couldn't be purchased or downloaded. Her hands held knowledge that Richard's millions couldn't buy, wisdom earned through years of patient practice and cultural inheritance. Late at night, alone in the pristine kitchen while the family slept in their separate wings of the penthouse, Marlene would sometimes allow herself to imagine a different life. Maybe she would open a small restaurant in the mission, a place where food was celebration rather than fuel, where customers knew her name and thanked her for meals that tasted like home. Maybe she would teach cooking classes to other immigrant women, sharing not just techniques, but the confidence that their cultural knowledge was valuable, that their skills deserved recognition and respect. But morning always returned with its demands for coffee preparation and breakfast service. With Richard's impatient instructions and Vanessa's casual contempt, with another day of being essential and invisible in a household that consumed her artistry while denying her humanity. Each sunrise brought renewed determination to endure, to maintain her standards, to preserve her dignity despite circumstances designed to strip it away. She had survived worse things than wealthy employers who mistook money for character. She would survive this too. Yet, survival felt different from living, and some mornings Marlene wondered how many years she could continue pouring her heart into food for people who had forgotten how to taste the love in what they consumed. There was one person in the Lennox household who still possessed the capacity to see Marlene as fully human, though she revealed this recognition slowly, carefully, like morning light gradually illuminating a room. Eleanor Whitman, Richard's 78-year-old mother-in-law, arrived each Thursday for what she called family dinner. But what everyone else understood to be her weekly inspection of the household, she still considered partially her own. Eleanor was Isabella's mother, a woman who had survived the Great Depression as a child, built a successful chain of women's clothing stores with her late husband, and then watched their daughter marry into tech money that made her own considerable fortune seem quaint by comparison. She possessed the kind of quiet authority that came from having earned respect rather than inherited it, and she was the only person in the penthouse who could make Richard fidget uncomfortably during conversations. Unlike her son-in-law and granddaughter, Eleanor noticed details that mattered. She observed the way Marlene's knife work had evolved over the years from competent to artistic, how her presentation style had adapted to the family's preferences while retaining subtle hints of her cultural background, how she could orchestrate complex multi-course meals with the timing precision of a symphony conductor. These were not skills that appeared randomly in domestic staff. They were evidence of talent, experience, and genuine care for the craft. Their relationship began with Eleanor's habit of arriving early for Thursday dinners, ostensibly to help, but actually to escape the loneliness of her Nob Hill apartment where every room held memories of her deceased daughter. She would sit at the kitchen counter watching Marlene work, initially making polite conversation, but gradually sharing more personal observations about cooking, about Isabella's childhood food preferences, about the recipes she wished she had preserved from her own mother's kitchen. Isabella never learned to cook properly, Eleanor confided one autumn evening, while Marlene prepared braised short ribs with root vegetables. I was so busy building the business that I never taught her. She could barely boil water when she married Richard. She always said she was going to learn someday when she had more time. Her voice trailed off into regret that no amount of money could purchase redemption for. Marlene had responded carefully, aware that any conversation about Isabella required diplomatic precision. She appreciated good food, she offered gently. She understood what makes a meal special. Even if she didn't cook herself, that's a gift too. You were patient with her, Eleanor continued. I watched you teach her small things, how to tell when garlic was perfectly minced, how to know when meat was properly rested. She was proud of those little skills. You gave her something I never could. These Thursday conversations became the bright spot in Marlene's increasingly difficult work week. Eleanor asked genuine questions about cooking techniques, about ingredient selection, about the cultural traditions that informed Marlene's approach to specific dishes. She listened to the answers with the attention of someone who understood that knowledge was valuable regardless of its source, that wisdom could be found in unexpected places if one was humble enough to look. More importantly, Eleanor began requesting specific dishes, not with the demanding tone Richard used, but with curiosity about how different flavors could be combined, how traditional Mexican techniques might complement ingredients from other culinary traditions. She encouraged experimentation, in ways that Richard's standardized preferences never allowed. "What would happen if we used your mole recipe but applied it to lamb instead of chicken?" she might ask. "Could we create something that honors both traditions without diminishing either?" These culinary conversations revealed a sophisticated palate and an appreciation for food as cultural expression rather than mere sustenance. Eleanor also possessed information about the household's history that no one else had shared with Marlene. She knew which dishes had been Isabella's favorites as a child, which flavors triggered happy memories, which meals had marked important family celebrations. This knowledge allowed Marlene to create subtle connections between past and present, to cook with deeper understanding of the emotional significance her food might carry. But their growing connection remained carefully circumscribed by social boundaries that even Eleanor's considerable authority couldn't completely dissolve. She could appreciate Marlene's artistry and engage with her intellectually, but she couldn't invite her to join the family for meals, couldn't publicly acknowledge her contributions during dinner parties, couldn't challenge the household's established hierarchy without creating conflicts that might ultimately harm Marlene's position. The limitation frustrated Eleanor visibly. She had built her own success through recognizing talent wherever she found it, through understanding that good ideas and skilled work deserved recognition regardless of their source. Watching her son-in-law dismiss Marlene's contributions while consuming the fruits of her labor clearly violated Eleanor's sense of justice, but challenging Richard directly might provoke retaliation against the person she was trying to protect. Instead, Eleanor found subtle ways to demonstrate her respect. She would ask detailed questions about recipes in front of Richard, forcing him to acknowledge that complex dishes required knowledge and skill. She would compliment specific aspects of meals during family conversations, making it impossible to ignore the artistry involved in their preparation. These small gestures didn't change the fundamental dynamics of the household, but they created moments of recognition that felt like oases in Marlene's professional desert. During one particularly meaningful conversation, Eleanor shared memories of her own mother's cooking during the Depression years. "Mama could make feasts from almost nothing," she recalled while watching Marlene roll out pasta dough by hand. "Potatoes, onions, maybe a little bacon fat if we were lucky. But somehow she made it taste like celebration. I never understood how she did it until I started watching you work. It's not about ingredients, is it? It's about intention, about caring enough to make something beautiful, even when no one notices." "My grandmother called it cooking with prayer," Marlene responded, her hands never pausing in their rhythmic kneading. Every dish was an opportunity to put love into the world, to take care of people whether they appreciated it or not. She said that was its own reward, but I think she never cooked for people who treated her like furniture. Eleanor's laugh was sharp with understanding. Oh, she probably did. Different era, same problems. Rich people have always had trouble seeing the humanity in people who serve them. It's a blindness that money makes worse, not better. These conversations created a sanctuary within Marlene's working week, a space where her knowledge was valued and her observations were heard with genuine interest. Eleanor became more than just another employer. She became something approaching a friend within the constraints that their respective positions allowed. But the relationship also highlighted everything that was missing in Marlene's interactions with the rest of the family. Richard barely acknowledged Eleanor's appreciation for the cooking, treating his mother-in-law's compliments as polite conversation rather than expert evaluation. Vanessa dismissed Eleanor's opinions as outdated sentiment from someone too old to understand modern food. The contrast made Marlene's daily invisibility feel even more painful by comparison. Eleanor occasionally brought gifts, not expensive items that might create awkward power dynamics, but small tokens that acknowledged their shared respect for culinary tradition. A vintage cookbook from her personal collection, a set of wooden spoons carved by California artisans, a jar of homemade vanilla extract she had been aging for 2 years. These gifts felt different from the generous but impersonal Christmas bonuses Richard provided. They were chosen with specific understanding of who Marlene was and what might bring her genuine pleasure. During Isabella's birthday each year, Eleanor would request a special meal featuring her daughter's favorite dishes. This became a sacred obligation for Marlene, an opportunity to honor the woman who had first seen her potential and appreciated her contributions. She would prepare Isabella's beloved tres leches cake, the seafood paella that had marked special celebrations, the simple roasted chicken with herbs that Isabella had considered the height of comfort food. These memorial meals were eaten in contemplative quiet, with Eleanor sharing memories and Marlene listening to stories about the woman whose absence still shaped the emotional landscape of the household. It was perhaps the only time when food was consumed in the Lennox penthouse with full awareness of the love and skill required for its creation, the only meal where the cook was remembered as essential rather than incidental. But even Eleanor's recognition couldn't shield Marlene from the systematic erosion of dignity that marked her daily experience. Thursday dinners provided temporary respite from invisibility, but the other 6 days of the week remained filled with casual dismissals and professional loneliness. The connection with Eleanor became both blessing and burden, proof that recognition was possible, making the lack of it from others feel even more deliberate and cruel. As Eleanor's visits became more frequent and their conversations deeper, Marlene began to hope that perhaps things might gradually change, that appreciation might slowly influence the rest of the household toward greater humanity. It was a fragile hope, easily wounded by Richard's continued indifference or Vanessa's casual cruelty, but it provided just enough light to make the darkness bearable. Eleanor saw her clearly, valued her contributions, understood her artistry. In a household where Marlene had begun to question her own worth, this recognition felt like water in a desert, sustaining her through days when dignity seemed like an unaffordable luxury. But it also made her eventually hungry for more, for a world where such recognition was normal rather than exceptional, where skilled work was valued regardless of who performed it. The storm that would reshape everything began with what seemed like an ordinary Tuesday morning request. Richard strode into the kitchen while Marlene prepared his usual breakfast, his phone pressed against his ear as he conducted business with Hong Kong markets that were already deep into their trading day. Bitcoin prices had surged overnight, adding another million to his digital wallet, and his mood reflected the intoxicating combination of caffeine and financial success. "Cancel the catering for Friday's investor dinner," he announced without preamble, as if Marlene had been privy to previous conversations about this event. "I want to showcase what our household can provide. Something impressive but not ostentatious. These are serious money people, not food tourists." Marlene paused in her preparation of his steel-cut oats, uncertain whether she was expected to respond or simply acknowledge his instructions. The Friday investor dinner had been planned for weeks as a catered affair handled by one of the city's premier event companies. 12 guests, each representing venture capital funds worth hundreds of millions, coming to discuss Richard's latest cryptocurrency venture. Now, with 3 days' notice, he expected her to prepare a meal worthy of such financial magnitude. "What kind of menu were you considering?" she asked carefully, setting his breakfast on the counter with the precise placement he preferred. Richard's attention had already shifted back to his phone call, numbers and percentages flowing through the speaker like a foreign language of profit and loss. He waved dismissively at her question, the gesture implying that such details were beneath his consideration. "Whatever you think appropriate. Eleanor seems to think you're capable of sophisticated cooking. Let's test that theory." The casual reference to Eleanor's praise felt like a test wrapped in an opportunity wrapped in a trap. Richard had clearly noticed his mother-in-law's growing appreciation for Marlene's work, but his tone suggested skepticism rather than confidence. This was not a chance to showcase her abilities. It was a challenge to prove them, with professional consequences hanging in the balance. "How many courses?" Marlene pressed gently. "Any dietary restrictions among the guests? Wine pairings?" "Figure it out," Richard replied curtly. "You've been cooking for 6 years. If you can't handle one dinner party without detailed instructions, Maybe Eleanor's confidence is misplaced. The implicit threat hung in the kitchen air like smoke from burned food. Richard was offering her enough rope to either pull herself to safety or fashion a noose, and she suspected he was genuinely curious which option she might choose. His recent financial successes had made him bolder in all areas of life, more willing to take risks and test boundaries. This dinner represented another form of investment, with Marlene's professional future serving as collateral. That afternoon brought a more ominous development. Chef Marcus Beaumont arrived at the penthouse for what Richard described as a consultation about upgrading the household's culinary capabilities. Beaumont was San Francisco food royalty, a James Beard Award winner whose restaurant commanded 3-month reservation waits, and whose private chef services cost more per meal than Marlene earned in a month. He swept through the kitchen like a conquering general, surveying captured territory, making notes about equipment upgrades and staff reorganization, while Marlene continued her prep work with studious invisibility. He possessed the kind of effortless arrogance that came from constant media attention and wealthy clients who competed to secure his services for their most important occasions. "The space has excellent bones," Beaumont announced to Richard during their tour. "Professional-grade equipment, adequate storage, good workflow design. What's missing is vision, elevated technique, the kind of culinary ambition that matches your portfolio success." Marlene understood immediately that she was witnessing her own professional funeral, conducted in the language of menu development and ingredient sourcing. Beaumont wasn't consulting about upgrades. He was auditing her replacement. Richard hadn't hired her to prepare Friday's investor dinner as a demonstration of confidence. He had created an opportunity for comparison, a chance to evaluate whether his current arrangements were worthy of his escalating social ambitions. The famous chef barely glanced at her during his inspection, treating her presence like kitchen equipment that might or might not be retained during renovations. When he did acknowledge her existence, it was with the patronizing courtesy that successful professionals reserve for people they consider irrelevant to their objectives. "What's your background?" he asked while examining her knife skills during vegetable prep. The question felt like a police interrogation rather than collegial curiosity. "Self-taught," Marlene replied honestly, her hands never pausing in their precise julienne of carrots. "Family recipes, traditional techniques." Beaumont's smile contained enough condescension to flavor a 5-course meal. "Charming. Very authentic. Richard, you've been dining on peasant food while thinking you had sophisticated cuisine. The potential here is extraordinary if we approach it with proper training and contemporary vision." The word peasant hit Marlene like a physical blow, delivered with surgical precision to inflict maximum damage while maintaining plausible deniability. Beaumont hadn't technically insulted her. He had simply categorized her cultural heritage and family traditions as inferior to his formal training and modern techniques. It was cruelty refined to an art form, polished until it could be mistaken for professional observation. Richard absorbed this assessment with the expression of someone discovering that his investment portfolio contained worthless securities. His glance at Marlene carried new skepticism, as if he were seeing her clearly for the first time and finding the view disappointing. 6 years of service were being re-evaluated through the lens of culinary status and social positioning. "I've been thinking exactly the same thing," Richard replied, though Marlene knew he had never considered her cooking anything other than adequate until Eleanor's comments had planted seeds of doubt. "Friday's dinner will be an excellent opportunity to assess our current capabilities against professional standards." The consultation continued for another hour, with Beaumont and Richard discussing menu possibilities, wine pairings, and service protocols while Marlene worked around them like a ghost haunting her own kitchen. They planned her audition without including her in the conversation, talking about maximizing the space's potential and elevating the household's culinary reputation as if she were a malfunctioning appliance rather than the person who had been creating those meals for years. When Beaumont finally departed, he left behind business cards and menu suggestions that felt like evidence planted at a crime scene. Richard studied these materials with the focus he usually reserved for cryptocurrency charts, clearly weighing the cost of upgrading his household staff against the social capital such changes might provide. "Friday's dinner is important," he announced to Marlene after reviewing Beaumont's proposals. "These investors control more money than some countries' annual budgets. Their opinion of this household could influence business relationships worth hundreds of millions. I need sophisticated food, flawless execution, and zero embarrassment." The pressure was explicit and impossible to misunderstand. Marlene's professional survival now depended on preparing a meal that could compete with San Francisco's finest restaurants while working alone in a kitchen designed for elaborate productions. She had 3 days to prove that her peasant food deserved to share the table with cryptocurrency fortunes and venture capital empires. But beneath the pressure and implicit threats, something fierce and proud stirred in Marlene's chest. Let them measure her against their famous chefs in formal training. Let them compare her family recipes to their molecular gastronomy and artistic presentations. She possessed knowledge that couldn't be taught in culinary schools, skills inherited through generations of women who had fed their families with love and improvisation. Her grandmother's ghost whispered encouragement, "Show them what real cooking looks like, mija." That night, Marlene sat in her small apartment kitchen, her real kitchen, where photographs smiled from every surface, and the stove held memories of 1,000 family meals, planning the menu that would determine her future. The recipes she chose carried the weight of cultural history, the flavors of her childhood, the techniques she had perfected through years of silent practice. This wouldn't be peasant food. This would be a masterpiece dressed in humble clothes, elegance that didn't require explanation or apology. Friday's dinner would reveal whether San Francisco's financial elite possessed palates sophisticated enough to recognize artistry when it appeared without expensive credentials or media attention. More importantly, it would demonstrate whether Marlene Rodriguez had the courage to stake her professional life on the belief that good food was indeed good food, regardless of who prepared it or where they had learned their craft. The battle lines were drawn in a kitchen that had become both battlefield and sanctuary. On one side stood formal training, celebrity credentials, and the assumption that sophistication required complexity. On the other side stood intuition, cultural inheritance, and the radical notion that love might be the most important ingredient in any recipe worth preparing. 3 days remained until Marlene would learn which philosophy would triumph in Richard Lennox's penthouse kingdom, where money could buy everything except the wisdom to distinguish between price and value. The morning of the investor dinner dawned gray and foggy. San Francisco weather that seemed to mirror the uncertainty clouding Marlene's professional future. She had arrived at the penthouse earlier than usual, carrying bags of ingredients selected with the care of a military strategist, choosing weapons for crucial battle. Each item had been personally inspected at the farmer's market, the fish counter, the specialty spice shops that understood quality beyond mere price. Richard had been unusually present in the kitchen that morning, lurking near the coffee station while conducting phone calls that seemed designed to demonstrate his importance rather than accomplish actual business. His nervous energy filled the space like electrical charge before a thunderstorm. The success of tonight's dinner had clearly assumed significance beyond mere entertaining. It had become a test of his household sophistication, which he in turn viewed as a reflection of his own status among San Francisco's financial elite. "The guests will arrive at 7:30 for cocktails," he announced unnecessarily, since he had provided this information 3 times already. "Dinner service at 8:15 sharp. These people operate on precise schedules. Delays cost money, and they don't tolerate inefficiency from anyone, including household staff." The implicit threat was clear. Any mistakes tonight would be attributed to Marlene's inadequacy rather than circumstances beyond her control. Richard was positioning himself to take credit for success while deflecting responsibility for failure, a strategy that had apparently served him well in his cryptocurrency investments. Vanessa had invited herself to observe the preparations, positioning herself at the kitchen counter like a judge overseeing criminal proceedings. Her presence added another layer of tension to an already charged atmosphere, her critical gaze following Marlene's every movement as if documenting evidence for future prosecution. "I still think you should have hired proper caterers," Vanessa commented, while Marlene began her mise en place, the careful organization of ingredients and tools that would transform raw materials into culinary artistry. "These people are used to restaurants like Atelier Crène and Benu. They'll notice if the food isn't up to their standards." Richard's expression suggested he was harboring similar doubts, but had committed too far to retreat without losing face. "Eleanor seems convinced that our current arrangements are adequate. Tonight will settle the question definitively." The menu Marlene had planned was ambitious but achievable, sophisticated but anchored in techniques she had spent years perfecting. She would begin with a ceviche that showcased pristine seafood through careful acid balance and bold flavor combinations. The main course featured short ribs braised in Mexican chocolate and chilies, elevated with classical French technique, but honoring the cultural traditions that had taught her to layer complex flavors. Dessert would be her grandmother's tres leches cake, refined through years of experimentation, but still recognizable as the comfort food that had marked celebrations throughout her childhood. Each dish told a story about her culinary journey, from the Mission District kitchen where she had learned to cook by watching and tasting, to the professional techniques she had developed through careful observation and relentless practice. This wasn't fusion cuisine designed to impress food critics. It was personal cooking that happened to be sophisticated enough for any dining room in the city. As the afternoon progressed, the kitchen filled with aromas that seemed to soften even Vanessa's harsh surveillance. The short ribs released layers of complexity as they braised, earthy chocolate notes mingling with bright citrus, gentle heat building slowly rather than attacking the palate. Familiar comfort elevated to unexpected elegance. The tres leches cake, cooling in the refrigerator, had achieved the perfect texture balance between solid and dream, its three milks creating a harmony that couldn't be replicated through shortcuts or substitutions. Eleanor arrived early, ostensibly to help with final preparations, but actually to provide moral support during Marlene's moment of professional truth. She surveyed the organized kitchen with approving eyes, noting the precision of Marlene's timing, the confident efficiency of her movements, the way complex preparations were orchestrating themselves into seamless service. "It smells like celebration in here," Eleanor observed, stealing a small taste of the braising liquid while Marlene plated the ceviche. "Like food that understands its own importance without becoming pretentious about it." "I just hope they can taste the care," Marlene replied quietly, her hands dancing across plates with artistic precision. Sometimes people's expectations get in the way of their actual experience. "Good food is good food," Eleanor declared with characteristic firmness. "Anyone with genuine sophistication will recognize quality regardless of where it originated. The rest are just food tourists pretending to have educated palates." By 7 o'clock, the dining room had been transformed into a stage worthy of the evening's financial drama. Crystal stemware caught light like liquid diamonds, silverware gleamed against pristine linens, and subtle floral arrangements provided elegance without competing with the food for attention. Richard had spared no expense on the setting. Baccarat glassware, Hermes china, wine selections that represented more money than most people's annual salaries. The first guests arrived precisely on schedule. 12 titans of venture capital and cryptocurrency investment, each worth more than small cities' annual budgets. They moved through Richard's penthouse like visiting royalty, examining the art collection and admiring the city views while discussing market opportunities that could reshape entire industries overnight. Their conversation flowed in a specialized dialect of IPOs and blockchain technology, profit margins, and exit strategies. Marlene watched from the kitchen as Richard played host, his nervous energy channeled into performance of sophisticated hospitality. He guided his guests through cocktails with the precision of someone who understood that every detail would be noticed and evaluated, that social missteps could translate into lost business opportunities worth millions. At 8:15 exactly, service began. Marlene had timed every element to achieve perfect synchronization. The ceviche was plated and ready. The short ribs had reached ideal tenderness. The sides were warming to precise temperatures. She moved through her final preparations with ballet-like grace, 6 years of practice in this kitchen culminating in one crucial performance. The first course went out silently, carried by temporary servers Richard had hired for the evening. Marlene remained in the kitchen, listening to the distant murmur of conversation, trying to gauge reactions from vocal tones and pauses in the discussion. The ceviche was a risk, bold flavors that announced themselves immediately, demanding attention rather than blending into background hospitality. Eleanor appeared in the kitchen doorway, her smile broad with satisfaction. "They're discussing the food," she reported quietly. Someone asked where Richard found such an excellent chef. Another commented on the quality of the seafood preparation. The main course service proceeded with military precision, each plate emerging from the kitchen as individual artwork. The short ribs had achieved the perfect balance of tender meat and complex sauce, the accompanying vegetables providing color and texture contrast while maintaining their own distinct flavors. It was ambitious cooking executed with confidence, technique in service of taste rather than mere demonstration. As dessert preparations began, Marlene could hear the conversation in the dining room growing more animated. The business discussions had given way to more personal topics, always a sign that guests were relaxed and genuinely enjoying themselves, rather than merely fulfilling social obligations. Someone was asking about wine pairings, another inquiring about specific techniques, the kind of engaged food talk that indicated genuine appreciation. The tres leches cake went out as the evening's final statement, comfort elevated to elegance, tradition refined but not disguised. It was the dish that carried most personal meaning for Marlene, the flavors that connected her most directly to family history and cultural identity. If the investors rejected this dessert, they would be rejecting her most authentic self. Eleanor returned to the kitchen as coffee was being served, her expression radiating triumph. "Complete success," she announced softly. 3 guests asked for the chef's name. 2 wanted to know if you were available for private events. Someone asked Richard where he found such exceptional talent. But Richard's reaction was not what Marlene had anticipated. Instead of pride or satisfaction, he seemed almost annoyed by his guests' enthusiasm. Their praise for the food had become praise for something beyond his control, recognition for talent he couldn't claim credit for creating. His investment in celebrity chef consultation had been rendered moot by what his guests considered superior results achieved through unconventional means. After the guests departed, the kitchen fell into exhausted quiet. Marlene began the familiar ritual of cleanup, organizing equipment and storing leftovers while replaying the evening service in her mind. She had achieved everything she had hoped for: flawless execution, enthusiastic reception, professional vindication. Yet Richard's sullen mood suggested that success might carry unexpected consequences. The test had been passed, but the judge seemed displeased by the verdict his own evidence had produced. The reckoning arrived on Monday morning with the casual cruelty that had become Richard's signature style of delivering bad news. Marlene was preparing his usual breakfast when he entered the kitchen carrying a folder of documents and wearing the expression of someone about to execute an unpleasant but necessary business transaction. "Friday's dinner was adequate," he announced without preamble, his tone suggesting that adequacy was insufficient for his elevated standards. The guests seemed satisfied, though I suspect they were being polite rather than genuinely impressed. "San Francisco has softened people's expectations for home dining," Marlene continued, whisking eggs for his omelet, recognizing the careful orchestration of his criticism. Richard was rewriting Friday's obvious success into qualified failure, creating retroactive justification for decisions he had apparently already made. The folder in his hands likely contained documentation that would formalize her professional execution. However, Richard continued, settling into his favorite counterstool with practiced authority, I've decided it's time to upgrade the household's culinary capabilities to match our evolving social requirements. Chef Beaumont has agreed to serve as our private chef on a part-time basis, handling important occasions and special events. The words hung in the kitchen air like smoke from burning food, acrid and unmistakable in their implications. Richard wasn't firing her directly. Such crude tactics were beneath someone who had made hundreds of millions through sophisticated financial manipulation. Instead, he was creating conditions that would force her resignation while maintaining plausible deniability about his motivations. Your responsibilities will shift to more basic meal preparation, he explained with the artificial sympathy of someone delivering rehearsed bad news. Daily breakfasts and lunches, simple dinners when we're not entertaining. Beaumont will handle anything requiring sophisticated technique or presentation. It's a more efficient division of labor that plays to everyone's strengths. Marlene plated his omelet with hands that remained steady through force of will, though her heart was pounding with the rhythm of approaching disaster. 6 years of faithful service were being casually discarded, her proven abilities dismissed as inadequate despite Friday's obvious success. Richard was choosing expensive mediocrity over demonstrated excellence, preferring credentials to actual results. The salary adjustment will reflect your reduced responsibilities, Richard continued, unfolding documents that formalized her professional demotion. 40% reduction, effective immediately. Still quite generous for basic meal preparation, especially considering the reduced stress and shorter working hours. The numbers on the contracts blurred as Marlene struggled to process the magnitude of what was happening. A 40% salary cut would make it impossible to maintain her apartment, support her aging mother, or contribute to her nephew's college fund. Richard was offering her the choice between financial devastation and voluntary resignation, a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. But worse than the financial implications was the systematic humiliation built into the new arrangement. She would remain in the kitchen as Chef Beaumont's assistant, relegated to chopping vegetables and washing dishes while he received credit for preparations she had been creating independently for years. Her expertise would be reduced to manual labor, her artistry dismissed as mere mechanics, unworthy of recognition or fair compensation. I understand this represents a significant change, Richard acknowledged with manufactured concern. If you feel the new position isn't suitable for your career goals, I'm prepared to provide excellent references and a generous severance package. No hard feelings, just business evolution that requires different capabilities. The severance offer was clearly designed to encourage her departure while allowing Richard to claim he had been fair and generous rather than cruel and manipulative. He could tell future guests that his previous chef had been adequately compensated for her service and had left to pursue other opportunities, rather than admitting he had driven away proven talent in favor of expensive status symbols. Marlene signed the documents because refusing would have meant immediate termination without severance, but her signature felt like signing her own death warrant. The kitchen that had been her domain for 6 years would become her prison, the space where she had created art reduced to a factory for basic sustenance under someone else's direction. The transformation began immediately. Chef Beaumont arrived that afternoon to survey his new workspace and establish protocols that would maximize efficiency while minimizing confusion about authority. He rearranged equipment to match his preferences, labeled storage areas according to his organizational system, and posted menus featuring dishes that required ingredients Marlene had never heard of and techniques she wasn't expected to understand. We'll start with simple tasks, he explained with patronizing patience. Basic prep work, ingredient organization, equipment maintenance, nothing too challenging while you adjust to the new approach. Professional kitchens operate differently from home cooking. The distinction between professional and home cooking was clearly intended to categorize her previous work as amateur effort regardless of its obvious quality. Beaumont was establishing hierarchies based on formal training rather than demonstrated ability, creating systems designed to highlight her supposed inadequacies rather than utilize her proven strengths. Vanessa delighted in the new arrangement with barely concealed satisfaction. She began bringing friends to watch Chef Beaumont work, treating the kitchen like dinner theater where they could observe real culinary artistry after years of enduring Marlene's supposedly primitive efforts. Their conversations were loud enough for Marlene to overhear while she washed dishes and cleaned prep surfaces. "Finally, we have proper food in this house," Vanessa announced during one such performance. "I was getting embarrassed to have friends over for dinner. Now we can actually compete with the other family's entertaining standards." Chef Beaumont basked in this attention while preparing dishes that were undeniably sophisticated but somehow soulless, technically perfect presentations that showcased his training while failing to create the emotional connections that had marked Marlene's cooking. His food was impressive but cold, like museum displays of culinary excellence rather than nourishment meant to be shared and savored. Eleanor was the only person who seemed disturbed by the kitchen's transformation. She continued her Thursday visits but grew increasingly quiet as she observed the new dynamics, watching Marlene relegated to menial tasks while Chef Beaumont commanded attention and credit for meals that relied heavily on her invisible preparations. "This is wrong," Eleanor stated bluntly during one Thursday dinner, her voice carrying disapproval that made Richard fidget uncomfortably. "You had excellence and you've replaced it with expensive mediocrity. That young man can cook, but he can't create the kind of meals that make a house feel like home." "Beaumont has James Beard recognition," Richard replied defensively. "His restaurant has Michelin ratings. These are objective measures of culinary quality, not subjective preferences." "Objective measures of what?" Eleanor challenged. "His ability to impress food critics? His skill at molecular gastronomy? What about his ability to make people happy with simple, perfect flavors? What about understanding that food is supposed to nourish souls, not just bodies?" But Richard had invested too much pride in his decision to acknowledge its obvious flaws. Chef Beaumont's expensive services reflected well on the household status, regardless of whether the actual food quality had improved. The twice-weekly appearances, the elaborate presentations, the constant references to elevated technique created an impression of sophistication that Richard valued more than actual dining satisfaction. Over the following weeks, Marlene watched her kitchen kingdom crumble into servitude. Tasks that had once been creative expression became mechanical labor performed under supervision. Ingredients she would have selected personally were now ordered according to Chef Beaumont's specifications, often sacrificing quality for convenience or visual impact. The rhythms of meal preparation that had once flowed naturally became regimented schedules designed around someone else's artistic vision. The salary reduction made every aspect of her life more difficult. She moved from her sunny Sunset District apartment to a smaller place in a less safe neighborhood, gave up the luxury of weekend farmers market shopping, and began buying generic groceries that stretched her reduced budget. Her mother's medical expenses became a constant worry, her nephew's college contributions an impossible dream deferred indefinitely. But the financial hardship was nothing compared to the daily humiliation of watching someone else receive credit for work that built upon her invisible foundations. Chef Beaumont's acclaimed dishes relied heavily on prep work Marlene performed, stocks she simmered, techniques she had perfected. Yet when guests complimented the meals, he accepted their praise without acknowledging the collaborative effort required for his success. The kitchen that had once been her sanctuary became a workplace designed to remind her daily of her diminished status, her supposed inadequacy, her essential invisibility in a household that consumed her labor while denying her humanity. She had become the ghost in her own professional story, present but unrecognized, essential but unacknowledged. Richard's cryptocurrency empire continued to grow exponentially during this period, his digital investments multiplying wealth faster than he could spend it. Yet despite unprecedented financial success, The household's actual happiness seemed to diminish proportionally. Meals became performances rather than shared experiences. Cooking became expense rather than investment in daily joy. Food became fuel rather than celebration. The irony was lost on Richard, but obvious to anyone who remembered what the kitchen had been like under Marlene's independent direction. Wealth had purchased sophistication but destroyed satisfaction, elevated status while eliminating soul, created impressive dinner parties that no one actually enjoyed. Marlene endured because she had no choice, but endurance felt different from living. Each day brought fresh evidence that talent without credentials was worthless in Richard's world, that cultural heritage had no value compared to formal training, that love was an inferior ingredient to technique. She had been professionally murdered and was now attending her own funeral on a daily basis, required to maintain the appearance of gratitude while mourning everything she had lost. The silence that followed Marlene's professional assassination was more deafening than any explosion. In the weeks following Chef Beaumont's installation as the kitchen's new sovereign, the household settled into rhythms that felt mechanically precise but emotionally hollow, like a luxury watch that kept perfect time while its owner had forgotten how to determine what moments actually mattered in the passage of days. Richard's dinner parties continued with increased frequency, each one showcasing Chef Beaumont's molecular gastronomy techniques and artistic presentations. The guests were appropriately impressed by dishes that looked like abstract sculptures and tasted like chemistry experiments, nodding approvingly while discussing the sophistication of their host's culinary arrangements. But something ineffable had vanished from these gatherings, the warmth that had once made even business dinners feel like celebrations of human connection. Eleanor noticed the change immediately. Her Thursday dinners became exercises in polite consumption rather than genuine enjoyment, each bite technically perfect but somehow vacant of the comfort that had once made her eager to visit. She would watch Chef Beaumont orchestrate elaborate presentations while Marlene washed dishes in the background, her expression growing more disapproving with each passing week. "This food has no memory," Eleanor observed quietly during one particularly ostentatious meal featuring spherical ravioli and foam-covered proteins. "It tastes like it was invented 5 minutes ago by someone who learned cooking from textbooks rather than grandmothers." Richard bristled at the implicit criticism. Beaumont's techniques are cutting edge. His presentations have been featured in Food and Wine magazine. These are innovative approaches that push culinary boundaries. "Pushing boundaries away from what?" Eleanor challenged. "Away from flavor? Away from satisfaction? Away from the kind of cooking that makes people want to linger at the table instead of checking their phones between courses?" But Richard had committed too deeply to his expensive mistake to retreat without losing face. Chef Beaumont's services cost more per month than Marlene's previous annual salary, a premium that had to be justified through continued employment, regardless of diminishing returns on the investment. Admitting error would mean acknowledging that he had squandered money while diminishing his household's actual quality of life, a possibility that Richard's ego couldn't accommodate. Vanessa initially basked in the kitchen's transformation, delighting in her friend's envious reactions to Chef Beaumont's elaborate creations. But even she began to notice that meals became less satisfying as they became more impressive, that she found herself craving simple flavors that the new regime couldn't provide despite its technical sophistication. "I keep wanting mac and cheese," she confided to her father during one breakfast, unaware that Marlene was listening from the pantry where she organized spices according to Chef Beaumont's color-coded system. Like really good mac and cheese, the kind that tastes like childhood instead of fine dining. Richard dismissed this longing as nostalgia for less sophisticated times, but Marlene recognized it as hunger for the emotional nourishment that Chef Beaumont's impressive dishes couldn't provide. His food filled stomachs without feeding souls, satisfied appetites without creating the memories that made meals meaningful beyond mere consumption. The kitchen itself seemed to reflect this emotional emptiness. Despite being busier than ever, With elaborate preparations requiring constant activity, the space felt lifeless. The laughter that had once echoed from Isabella's visits, the quiet satisfaction of perfectly timed family meals, the sense of creative accomplishment that had made long days worthwhile, all of this had evaporated, replaced by mechanical efficiency and professional distance. Marlene moved through these transformed rhythms like a ghost, haunting her own former life. Her responsibilities had been reduced to maintenance tasks that required no creativity or decision-making: washing dishes, organizing storage areas, running errands to specialty food stores for ingredients she wasn't trusted to select personally. She had become kitchen furniture, essential for basic operations but invisible to the actual creative process. The financial pressure intensified as weeks passed. Her reduced salary had eliminated any margin for unexpected expenses, turning every small crisis into major catastrophe. When her mother needed prescription medications not covered by Medicare, Marlene had to choose between her own grocery budget and her family's medical needs. When her nephew's school required computer supplies for advanced classes, she had to explain why Tia Marlene couldn't help with educational expenses that had once been manageable contributions. Her new apartment in the Outer Mission reflected her diminished circumstances: smaller, darker, farther from the bus lines that connected her to the financial district towers where she still worked. The building's shared laundry room and paper-thin walls were constant reminders of dreams deferred, of professional accomplishments that had been systematically erased despite their obvious quality. But perhaps most painful was the isolation that had replaced the community she had found in Eleanor's appreciation and Isabella's friendship. Chef Beaumont treated her as manual labor rather than skilled colleague, addressing her with the impersonal courtesy reserved for service providers who weren't expected to have opinions or feelings. Richard barely acknowledged her presence unless she made mistakes, and Vanessa had returned to treating her like animated furniture that occasionally required maintenance. The silence in her own small kitchen at home became oppressive during evening hours when she should have been experimenting with new recipes or preparing meals that brought her joy. Instead, she found herself eating simple foods that required minimal preparation. Her creative energy exhausted by days spent watching someone else receive credit for work that built upon her invisible contributions. Sleep became elusive as financial anxiety combined with professional humiliation to create a persistent state of low-level crisis. She would lie awake calculating monthly expenses against her reduced income, searching for additional cuts that might balance budgets already stretched beyond sustainability. The bedroom ceiling became a projection screen for fears about her mother's health, her nephew's future, her own prospects for recovery from professional catastrophe. During quiet moments in the penthouse kitchen, while Chef Beaumont consulted with Richard about menu planning and special events, Marlene would sometimes catch glimpses of the life she had built over 6 years, the spice blends she had perfected, the techniques she had developed, the relationships with local suppliers who had learned to trust her judgment about quality and seasonality. All of this professional infrastructure was being dismantled or reassigned, her expertise rebranded as Chef Beaumont's innovation despite the obvious continuities. Eleanor's distress at these changes manifested in increasingly pointed comments during family dinners. She would ask direct questions about preparation techniques, forcing Chef Beaumont to acknowledge ingredients or methods that bore suspicious resemblance to Marlene's previous approaches. Her praise for specific dishes came weighted with implications about their true origins, compliments that felt more like accusations delivered with diplomatic precision. "This braising liquid is remarkably similar to something I tasted here before," Eleanor might observe, while savoring short ribs that relied heavily on Marlene's stock preparations. Such a distinctive flavor profile, almost like family recipe rather than restaurant technique. Chef Beaumont would deflect these observations with references to classical French methods or contemporary innovation, but Eleanor's knowing glances toward Marlene made clear her understanding of the actual creative lineage. These small moments of recognition provided brief warmth in an otherwise Arctic professional environment, acknowledgement that someone still saw through the elaborate deception that had redefined her contributions as someone else's accomplishments. The household's overall atmosphere grew increasingly tense as the gap between expensive sophistication and actual satisfaction became impossible to ignore. Richard's guests still made appropriate compliments about dinner party presentations, but their enthusiasm felt dutiful rather than genuine. Conversations about food became briefer, less engaged, as if the meals were obstacles to overcome rather than experiences to savor and remember. Most revealing were the late-night refrigerator raids that began occurring with increasing frequency. Richard would appear in the kitchen at midnight, searching for simple comfort foods that Chef Beaumont's elevated cuisine couldn't provide. Vanessa would request basic sandwiches for lunch instead of the elaborate salads that looked like floral arrangements, but left her hungry within hours. These requests inevitably fell to Marlene, creating situations where her simple preparations provided more satisfaction than Chef Beaumont's award-winning techniques. But the irony remained unacknowledged, her contributions invisible, even when they were directly addressing needs that the expensive alternative couldn't meet. The silence that had settled over the household wasn't the comfortable quiet of contentment. It was the heavy stillness of people who had lost something important, but couldn't quite identify what was missing or how to recover it. Wealth had purchased sophistication while destroying satisfaction, elevated appearances while eliminating substance, created impressive displays while starving the very souls those displays were meant to nourish. Marlene continued to endure because alternatives seemed non-existent, but endurance had become survival rather than living. Each day brought fresh evidence that her professional murder had been nearly perfect, accomplished with such systematic precision that even she sometimes wondered if her previous contributions had been as valuable as they now seemed in memory. The silence was designed to make her question her own worth, doubt her own abilities, accept her diminished status as accurate reflection of her actual limitations. But in the deepest hours of night, when the penthouse settled into sleep, and even the kitchen equipment hummed more quietly, Marlene's stubborn pride still flickered like a pilot light that refused to be extinguished. She knew what she had created in this space, knew the love that had flavored every meal, knew the skill that had transformed simple ingredients into nourishment that fed both body and soul. That knowledge couldn't be erased by professional humiliation or financial pressure or systematic invisibility. The truth was still there, waiting to be remembered by people who had temporarily forgotten how to taste the love in their food. The catalyst for revelation arrived disguised as routine. Eleanor's usual Thursday dinner request, submitted through Richard rather than directly to Chef Beaumont, a small breach of household protocol that should have been insignificant. She wanted comfort food, she explained. Something simple and satisfying instead of the architectural presentations that had been gracing their table for the past 2 months. Maybe something like those short ribs from last spring, Eleanor suggested carefully, her words chosen to test whether anyone remembered meals from before the kitchen's regime change. Or that wonderful tres leches cake, food that tastes like it comes from someone's actual kitchen instead of a laboratory. Richard's discomfort with this request was visible but manageable. He couldn't refuse his mother-in-law's modest dining preferences without appearing unreasonably controlling. But when he relayed the request to Chef Beaumont, the response revealed cracks in the expensive facade that had been carefully maintained for months. "I don't have recipes for those specific dishes," Beaumont admitted with visible irritation. "My style focuses on contemporary techniques and seasonal innovation. I can prepare short ribs using classical French methods with modern presentation standards. As for tres leches cake, that's fairly pedestrian dessert work. I could create a deconstructed version with elevated components." The admission hung in the kitchen air like smoke from burning food. Despite 2 months of access to the same ingredients, the same equipment, the same suppliers that had produced the dishes Eleanor remembered so fondly, Chef Beaumont couldn't recreate the flavors that had made those meals memorable. His sophisticated techniques were apparently incompatible with the simple perfection Eleanor was requesting. Richard found himself in an impossible position. He couldn't admit that his expensive chef couldn't prepare dishes that his previous kitchen arrangements had produced routinely. But he also couldn't disappoint Eleanor by serving substitutes that would highlight the inadequacies of his recent personnel decisions. Either choice would require acknowledging that his kitchen upgrade had actually been a lateral move at best, possibly expensive degradation disguised as improvement. The solution that emerged was as predictable as it was humiliating for everyone involved. Richard would quietly ask Marlene to prepare Eleanor's requested dishes, then present them as collaborative efforts between herself and Chef Beaumont. This arrangement would provide the flavors Eleanor wanted while maintaining the fiction that his elevated culinary arrangements were functioning successfully. "It's just for this one dinner," Richard explained to Marlene, while Chef Beaumont sulked in the dining room. "Eleanor has specific preferences based on previous meals. You can assist Beaumont with the preparation details, provide guidance about those particular recipes." The careful language couldn't disguise what was actually happening. Richard was acknowledging, however reluctantly, that Marlene possessed knowledge and abilities that his expensive chef lacked. The recipes he had dismissed as peasant food were being quietly reinstated because sophisticated alternatives couldn't provide the satisfaction his family actually craved. Marlene agreed to the arrangement because refusing would have certainly meant immediate termination. But she approached the preparation with complex emotions, vindication mixed with resentment, professional satisfaction tempered by awareness that this recognition would likely be temporary and unofficial. She was being asked to save Chef Beaumont from embarrassment while receiving no credit for the rescue operation. The cooking process revealed the extent to which Chef Beaumont's acclaimed skills were actually quite narrow. He could execute complex techniques flawlessly, could create elaborate presentations that photographed beautifully, could discuss molecular gastronomy with impressive authority. But he couldn't taste his way through traditional recipes, couldn't adjust seasonings based on intuition and experience, couldn't recognize when simple preparations had achieved the perfect balance that made them memorable. As Marlene guided the braising process for the short ribs, patiently explaining how different chilies contributed to the complex sauce that made this dish special, Chef Beaumont's discomfort became increasingly apparent. His formal training hadn't included this type of intuitive cooking, hadn't taught him to trust his senses over precise measurements, hadn't developed his palate for the kind of layered flavors that required cultural knowledge rather than technical education. "How do you know when it's ready?" he asked while watching Marlene taste the sauce for the third time, making tiny adjustments that couldn't be quantified in recipes or duplicated through mechanical following of instructions. "It tells you," Marlene replied simply, stirring the pot with motions that looked casual but reflected years of practice. The smell changes, the color deepens, the flavors marry instead of competing. "You have to listen to what the food is saying." This kind of cooking mystified Chef Beaumont because it required genuine understanding of ingredients rather than mere technical manipulation. His molecular gastronomy training had taught him to transform foods into different forms, liquids into solids, familiar flavors into surprising presentations, but hadn't developed his ability to coax maximum flavor from simple ingredients through patient technique and cultural wisdom. The tres leches cake presented even greater challenges. Its apparent simplicity was deceptive. 3 milks had to be balanced perfectly. The sponge needed exactly the right texture to absorb liquids without becoming soggy. Timing was crucial for achieving the ideal consistency. Chef Beaumont watched Marlene work with growing frustration, unable to document techniques that relied on sensory feedback rather than precise measurements. "Could you write down the exact proportions?" he asked hopefully. "The timing for each step? I should be able to replicate this for future occasions." Marlene smiled sadly while whipping cream to perfect peaks, knowing that recipes couldn't capture the knowledge that made this dessert special. "I learned from watching my grandmother. She never measured anything, just Cooked until it looked right, tasted right, felt right. The recipe is in my hands, not on paper. The admission revealed the fundamental difference between their approaches to cooking. Chef Beaumont's technical expertise was reproducible and teachable, but it couldn't access the cultural knowledge and emotional understanding that transformed simple ingredients into memorable experiences. His sophisticated training was actually limiting in situations that required intuitive connection to food and flavors. When Thursday evening arrived, the dinner proceeded with surface normalcy that concealed deeper tensions. Eleanor tasted the short ribs with obvious pleasure, her expression brightening as familiar flavors awakened memories of meals she had genuinely enjoyed. The tres leches cake earned actual enthusiasm rather than polite appreciation, her compliments carrying the warmth of recognition rather than dutiful courtesy. "This is what I remember," she announced with satisfaction. "Food that tastes like it comes from someone who understands what makes a meal special." Whoever prepared this tonight understands the difference between cooking and nourishment. Richard watched his mother-in-law's genuine happiness with growing discomfort, realizing that her pleasure highlighted everything that had been missing from recent meals. Chef Beaumont's technical achievements couldn't produce the kind of satisfaction Eleanor was demonstrating, couldn't create the emotional connections that transformed eating from mere consumption into actual pleasure. But the most revealing moment came when Eleanor asked about the preparation process, wondering aloud how such complex flavors had been achieved. Chef Beaumont began explaining his contributions, the modern techniques he had applied. The contemporary Chef Beaumont began explaining his contributions, the modern techniques he had applied, the contemporary presentation methods he had utilized. But Eleanor's knowing gaze found Marlene standing quietly near the kitchen doorway, and something in that glance made everything clear. "These flavors are familiar," Eleanor said slowly, her voice carrying implications that made Richard shift uncomfortably in his chair. "They remind me of meals from before the kitchen changes, almost like the same hands prepared them." The observation hung in the dining room like incense, filling the space with recognition that couldn't be easily dismissed or deflected. Eleanor wasn't merely commenting on food quality. She was identifying the true source of the evening's success, the invisible artistry that had rescued Chef Beaumont from professional embarrassment. Richard attempted to diffuse the tension with corporate smoothness. "Beaumont has been working with our existing staff to maintain continuity of flavors while elevating presentation standards. It's a collaborative approach that combines traditional techniques with contemporary innovation." But Eleanor wasn't easily satisfied by diplomatic language designed to obscure uncomfortable truths. Her sharp eyes moved between Chef Beaumont's nervous fidgeting and Marlene's carefully neutral expression, reading the dynamics that office speak couldn't disguise. "Marlene," Eleanor said directly, ignoring protocol that should have required her to address the official chef rather than the allegedly subordinate assistant. "Did you help prepare tonight's meal?" The question was simple, but loaded with implications that could reshape the entire household's understanding of recent months. Marlene stood at a crossroads between professional safety and personal dignity, between maintaining useful fiction and speaking inconvenient truth. "I assisted with some of the traditional elements," Marlene answered carefully, choosing words that acknowledged her contributions without directly challenging the official hierarchy. "The braising technique, the cake preparation, techniques I learned from my family." Eleanor smiled with satisfaction that cut through diplomatic evasions like acid through metal. "I thought so. These flavors carry memory. They taste like food prepared by someone who learned cooking from love rather than textbooks, someone who understands the technique serves flavor rather than the reverse." Chef Beaumont's discomfort became visible as Eleanor's compliments implicitly criticized his own approach while praising methods he couldn't duplicate. His expensive training hadn't prepared him for this type of cultural evaluation, hadn't taught him to navigate situations where formal credentials mattered less than actual results. Traditional techniques certainly have their place, he began defensively, but contemporary culinary education provides scientific understanding of flavor development, precise control over cooking processes. Does it teach you to make food that people actually want to eat? Eleanor interrupted sharply. Because I've been choking down your scientific presentations for weeks while longing for meals that taste like someone cares, whether I enjoy them or just survive them. The brutal honesty sliced through months of polite tolerance, revealing Eleanor's true evaluation of the kitchen's transformation. She had been suffering through elaborate meals while remembering simpler food that had provided genuine satisfaction, enduring sophisticated mediocrity while mourning authentic excellence. Richard's face cycled through expressions of embarrassment, anger, and calculation as he processed the implications of Eleanor's declaration. His expensive investment in contemporary culinary sophistication was being publicly dismissed by someone whose opinion he couldn't ignore, whose approval he needed for family harmony and social stability. Vanessa, who had been scrolling through her phone during most of the dinner, suddenly looked up with attention, sparked by the unusual tension crackling around the table. She rarely paid attention to adult conversations about household management, but conflict had a way of commanding her focus. "What's the big deal about who cooked what?" she asked with typical teenage directness. "The food was good tonight. Better than usual, actually. Why does it matter whose recipe it was?" Eleanor seized the opening that Vanessa's innocent question provided. "It matters because authenticity matters, because there's a difference between food that's prepared by someone who learned techniques to show off and food that's prepared by someone who learned techniques to take care of people." The distinction was sharp and impossible to misunderstand. Eleanor was dividing cooking into categories that prioritized emotional nourishment over technical achievement, suggesting that Marlene's supposedly inferior methods were actually superior where satisfaction was concerned. "Marlene's cooking has heart," Eleanor continued, her voice growing stronger as she abandoned diplomatic restraint in favor of honest evaluation. "It tastes like food prepared by someone who understands that meals are supposed to create happiness, not just demonstrate skill. That's why tonight felt different. That's why I actually wanted to finish everything on my plate instead of rearranging it politely." Chef Beaumont's professional pride couldn't absorb this level of public criticism without response. His reputation had been built through years of media attention and industry recognition, credentials that should carry more weight than the subjective preferences of elderly women who favored outdated cooking styles. "With respect, Mrs. Whitman, contemporary cuisine requires sophisticated palate development to fully appreciate," he replied with barely controlled irritation. "Traditional preparations can seem more familiar, but they lack the complexity and innovation that define current culinary standards." Eleanor's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Current standards according to whom? Food critics who judge meals by how many techniques they recognize instead of how much pleasure they provide? Chefs who care more about Instagram presentations than whether people leave the table feeling nourished instead of merely fed? The philosophical divide couldn't be bridged by compromise or diplomacy." Eleanor was advocating for cooking that prioritized human connection over professional achievement, while Chef Beaumont represented industry standards that valued innovation over satisfaction. These were fundamentally incompatible approaches to the same craft. Richard found himself trapped between his expensive investment in contemporary sophistication and his mother-in-law's clear preference for previous arrangements. Changing course would require admitting that his personnel decisions had been guided by status rather than quality, that expensive credentials didn't guarantee superior results. But Eleanor wasn't finished with her evaluation. Having begun to speak honestly about the kitchen's transformation, she seemed determined to address months of accumulated frustration with diplomatic silence that had achieved nothing except diplomatic exhaustion. "I've eaten more meals in this house than anyone except Richard," she announced with gathering force. "I remember when dinners were events I looked forward to instead of obligations I endured. I remember when food tasted like it was prepared by someone who wanted me to be happy instead of someone who wanted to impress me. The contrast she was drawing became impossible to ignore. Eleanor was testifying that measurable decline in dining satisfaction had accompanied the upgrade to more sophisticated culinary arrangements. Her evidence was personal but compelling, months of direct experience that contradicted the professional superiority Chef Beaumont's credentials were supposed to guarantee. "Marlene's food has soul," Eleanor declared, her eyes finding the woman who stood quietly near the kitchen doorway, neither advancing nor retreating from recognition that could reshape her professional circumstances. "It tastes like food prepared by someone who learned cooking as expression of love rather than demonstration of technical mastery." The words hung in the dining room's rarefied air like prayer flags marking sacred territory, acknowledgement of artistry that had been systematically overlooked for months. Eleanor was providing public recognition that Richard's household arrangements had been misguided, that expensive sophistication had replaced genuine quality with impressive mediocrity. Marlene stood frozen at the threshold between visibility and invisibility, recognition and continued exile, restoration and acceptance of diminished circumstances. Eleanor's advocacy was generous and dangerous, powerful enough to change everything, risky enough to destroy what little professional security remained. The moment stretched like taffy, sweet with possibility but fragile enough to snap at any sudden movement. Everyone around the table seemed to understand that Eleanor's declaration had created a crisis that would require resolution, that the household's pretenses about culinary improvement could no longer be maintained in the face of honest evaluation. Richard's cryptocurrency fortune could buy many things: sophisticated equipment, celebrity chefs, impressive presentations, but it couldn't purchase the wisdom to distinguish between price and value, couldn't download the cultural knowledge that made simple food transcendent, couldn't invest in the kind of care that transformed cooking from profession into art form. The truth was spreading through the room like aroma from a perfectly seasoned sauce, unmistakable and impossible to ignore once properly recognized. The transformation that followed Eleanor's declaration moved through the household like dawn, gradually illuminating a landscape that had been shrouded in artificial darkness. Her testimony had created a crack in the facade that Richard had been maintaining around his culinary arrangements, and once authentic evaluation began, the pretenses became impossible to sustain. Over the following days, small acknowledgments began accumulating like evidence in a trial where the verdict was becoming increasingly obvious. Vanessa made offhand comments about preferring the previous night's dessert to anything they had been served in recent months. Richard's business guests, when pressed for honest opinions about recent dinner parties, admitted that the presentations were impressive, but the experiences were somehow less memorable than previous occasions. Even Chef Beaumont seemed to recognize that his position had become untenable. His sophisticated techniques couldn't produce the emotional satisfaction that the household actually craved, couldn't replicate flavors that had been created through cultural knowledge rather than culinary school training. His twice-weekly appearances became increasingly tense affairs where he attempted to demonstrate value through elaborate preparations that consistently failed to generate genuine enthusiasm. Richard found himself facing the kind of decision that his business training hadn't prepared him to evaluate. The metrics that guided his investment strategies, credentials, reputation, market recognition, had failed to predict actual performance in his own kitchen. His expensive upgrade had been downgrade disguised by professional packaging, sophisticated presentation that concealed diminished substance. The financial calculations were particularly galling. Chef Beaumont's monthly fees exceeded Marlene's previous annual salary, while providing demonstration-grade cooking instead of the daily excellence that had once characterized family meals. Richard was paying premium prices for inferior results, a situation that violated every principle of successful investment strategy. But admitting error would require confronting deeper truths about the assumptions that had guided his personnel decisions. He had dismissed Marlene's contributions because she lacked formal credentials, had assumed that expensive training guaranteed superior results, had confused status symbols with actual quality. These mistakes revealed judgment failures that extended beyond kitchen management into questions about his ability to recognize value in other contexts. The revelation process accelerated when Richard decided to conduct what he privately called market research about his household's culinary reputation. He began paying closer attention to guest reactions during dinner parties, soliciting honest feedback about meal quality, comparing current responses to memories of previous entertaining experiences. The results were diplomatically devastating. Guests praised Chef Beaumont's technical skills while expressing subtle preferences for previous dining experiences they remembered more fondly. Conversations about food had become briefer and less enthusiastic. Complaints about dietary restrictions had increased. Requests for second servings had virtually disappeared. Most revealing were the informal conversations that occurred after official dinners ended. Richard overheard guests discussing other households where they enjoyed eating more, restaurants that provided more satisfying experiences, their own home cooking that seemed more emotionally nourishing than his elaborate presentations. His dinner parties had become obligations for attendance rather than anticipated pleasures. The tipping point arrived during a critical business dinner where Richard was courting venture capital investment in his latest cryptocurrency venture. The stakes were exceptionally high, potential funding that could multiply his already substantial wealth if negotiations succeeded. Every detail had to demonstrate sophistication and success, including the culinary arrangements that would frame the entire evening. Chef Beaumont prepared his most ambitious menu for the occasion, featuring techniques that showcased his molecular gastronomy training and presentations that looked like abstract art installations. The visual impact was undeniable, the technical execution flawless, the cost per plate astronomical. On paper, everything should have supported Richard's image as someone who operated at the highest levels of contemporary culture. But the investors' reactions revealed the gap between impressive appearances and actual appeal. They made appropriate compliments about the innovative presentations while eating smaller portions than usual, asked for bread rather than appreciating the complex appetizers, seemed more interested in business discussions than culinary experiences. The meal became backdrop rather than enhancement for the evening's objectives. One investor, after several glasses of wine, loosened his diplomatic restraint, made an observation that cut through Richard's carefully constructed image. Fascinating food, but I keep wanting something more familiar. More like comfort food than art project. You know what I mean? Richard knew exactly what the investor meant, and the knowledge was devastating. His expensive culinary arrangements were failing to provide basic hospitality, were creating distance rather than connection, were demonstrating sophistication without generating satisfaction. The dinner was technically successful but emotionally flat, impressive but unmemorable. That night, after the guests departed and Chef Beaumont completed his elaborate cleanup procedures, Richard stood alone in his gleaming kitchen and finally admitted the truth that Eleanor had been declaring for weeks. His personnel decisions had been guided by status rather than quality, expensive credentials rather than proven results, professional reputation rather than actual performance. The admission was painful, but liberating. Once he stopped defending decisions that had been obviously misguided, Richard could begin considering alternatives that might actually serve his household's needs rather than merely projecting appropriate images to social observers. The conversation with Chef Beaumont was conducted with the same corporate efficiency that Richard applied to unsuccessful business ventures. Services would be terminated with generous compensation. References would emphasize technical excellence rather than cultural fit. Future recommendations would specify contexts where molecular gastronomy might be more appropriate than traditional comfort food. Chef Beaumont received the news with professional grace that concealed obvious relief. His assignment to the Lennox household had been lucrative but frustrating, requiring him to work in contexts that didn't showcase his strengths while competing with memories of cooking styles he couldn't replicate. His skills were genuine but specialized, better suited to restaurant environments than family kitchens where emotional nourishment mattered more than artistic innovation. The more difficult conversation was the one Richard needed to have with Marlene. Her professional treatment over recent months had been systematically unfair, her contributions dismissed despite their obvious quality, her expertise devalued in favor of expensive alternatives that had proven inferior where satisfaction was concerned. Apologizing would require acknowledging that his judgment had been severely flawed, that his assumptions about culinary quality had been fundamentally wrong. But business principles that guided Richard's investment strategies also suggested that acknowledging mistakes quickly was preferable to continuing failed approaches indefinitely. Marlene's skills had been proven through years of stellar performance. Her cultural knowledge provided competitive advantages that formal training couldn't replicate. Her understanding of the household's preferences was irreplaceable asset rather than common commodity. The restoration began with private acknowledgement of error and gradual rebuilding of professional arrangements that honored actual contributions rather than impressive credentials. Richard offered Marlene full reinstatement with salary increases that reflected her true value to household operations, additional responsibilities that recognized her expertise, working conditions that supported creativity rather than merely compliance with someone else's artistic vision. But more important than financial adjustments was the symbolic significance of recognition itself. Eleanor's advocacy had forced honest evaluation of cooking quality, had demonstrated that simple satisfaction trumped sophisticated presentation when genuine happiness was the objective. Marlene's artistry had been vindicated by the most reliable metric possible, the reactions of people who consumed her food daily rather than critics who judged it professionally. The kitchen began transforming back into space where cooking served nourishment rather than demonstration, where techniques supported flavor rather than showcasing formal training, where meals created connections rather than merely providing sustenance. The change was immediately noticeable to anyone who would remember what excellence actually felt like when it appeared on their plates. Eleanor's Thursday dinners became celebrations of restoration rather than tests of endurance, occasions when conversation flowed as smoothly as properly prepared sauces, where second helpings were routine rather than rare occurrences. Her satisfaction was visible proof that expensive sophistication had been replaced by authentic quality, that genuine expertise had been restored to its rightful prominence. But perhaps most significantly, Richard's final admission of his mistakes in the kitchen forced him to consider whether similar errors might be affecting other aspects of his life and business decisions. If expensive credentials didn't guarantee superior performance in culinary contexts, what other assumptions about quality and value might be worth reevaluating? The lessons learned in his own kitchen began influencing Richard's approach to investment strategies, personnel decisions, and relationship evaluations throughout his professional and personal life. Success revealed itself as more complex than simple accumulation of impressive credentials or status symbols, requiring wisdom to distinguish between price and value, appearance and substance, reputation and actual results. Marlene's return to full authority in the kitchen represented more than simple correction of staffing error. It demonstrated the possibility of recognizing authentic excellence regardless of its packaging, appreciating cultural knowledge as valuable resource rather than primitive limitation, understanding that some forms of expertise couldn't be purchased but had to be earned through patient practice and genuine care. The household began remembering what satisfied dining actually felt like when love was included among the ingredients. 1 year after Eleanor's declaration at that pivotal Thursday dinner, the Lennox penthouse had settled into rhythms that felt both familiar and subtly transformed, like a favorite song being played in a better key that made every note ring more true. The kitchen had returned to being Marlene's domain, but her status within the household had shifted from invisible service to recognized artistry, from tolerated presence to valued family member in all but formal designation. Richard's business associates, many of whom had endured months of Chef Beaumont's molecular gastronomy experiments, began requesting dinner invitations with enthusiasm that had been absent during the sophisticated presentation phase. Word spread through San Francisco's financial circles about the exceptional private chef who could create memorable dining experiences that supported business relationships rather than merely demonstrating wealth. These compliments carried particular satisfaction for Richard because they reflected genuine appreciation rather than polite obligation. His dinner parties had become anticipated pleasures rather than endured social requirements, occasions when guests lingered over coffee and dessert instead of checking phones and making early departure excuses. The meals had regained their power to create connections, the kind of warm memories that strengthened professional relationships beyond mere transactional interactions. Marlene's restoration had been complete and generous. Her salary reflected her true contribution to household operations. Her schedule allowed for creative meal planning rather than mere routine compliance. Her input was sought on everything from menu development to kitchen equipment upgrades. But perhaps most meaningful was the simple acknowledgement of her expertise, the recognition that her cultural knowledge and intuitive techniques constituted valuable intellectual property rather than primitive limitations. The tres leches cake that had marked Isabella's birthday celebrations became an annual tradition that honored memory while creating new happiness. Each March, Marlene would prepare the dessert with particular care, knowing that Eleanor and Richard would share stories about Isabella while savoring flavors that connected past celebrations to present gratitude. The cake had become edible prayer, comfort food that acknowledged loss while affirming life's continuing capacity for sweetness. Eleanor's Thursday dinners evolved into informal cooking lessons where Marlene shared techniques while Eleanor contributed family stories that provided cultural context for specific dishes. These sessions created intergenerational exchange that honored both tradition and innovation, showing how recipes could preserve memory while adapting to contemporary circumstances. "You've taught me something important about recognition," Eleanor confided during one autumn afternoon while Marlene demonstrated proper technique for making mole sauce. "I spent decades in business thinking that formal credentials were the best measure of capability. Watching your treatment in this household made me realize how often I probably overlooked talented people because they didn't have appropriate certificates or impressive resumes." The observation resonated beyond kitchen applications. Marlene's vindication had provided broader lessons about identifying authentic excellence, about understanding that skill and care could develop through paths that didn't follow conventional educational routes. Her success challenged assumptions about who could create value and how that value should be measured by systems that often prioritized appearance over substance. Richard's approach to investment strategies had also been influenced by his kitchen revelations. He began conducting more thorough due diligence that emphasized actual performance over impressive presentations, started seeking advice from sources that demonstrated practical wisdom rather than merely theoretical knowledge, began questioning his own assumptions about what constituted sophisticated decision-making in various contexts. "Good food turned out to be like good investment," he explained to Eleanor during one family dinner. The impressive presentations often cover up fundamental weaknesses, while the simple approaches that focus on quality basics tend to provide more consistent satisfaction. "I was paying for style when I should have been investing in substance." Vanessa's transformation had been perhaps most dramatic of all family members. Her previous dismissal of Marlene's contributions had given way to genuine appreciation that included requests for cooking instruction, acknowledgement of cultural knowledge that was lacking in her expensive private school education, recognition that some forms of learning were more valuable than formal classroom experiences. "I want to learn these techniques before I go to college," Vanessa announced during a summer afternoon, spent learning to prepare fresh salsa from tomatoes, onions, and chilies that Marlene had selected at the farmer's market. I realized I don't actually know how to create anything useful with my hands. Everything I know comes from books or screens, but you know how to transform raw ingredients into something that makes people happy. The reversal was complete and humbling. Vanessa had progressed from treating Marlene as invisible furniture to recognizing her as teacher whose knowledge couldn't be acquired through conventional education, whose skills represented cultural inheritance worth preserving and passing forward to future generations. The farmers' market excursions had become weekly adventures where Marlene educated household members about seasonal ingredients, sustainable agriculture, and the relationships between local producers and urban consumers. These trips provided education about food systems that connected kitchen techniques to broader environmental and economic considerations, showing how individual meal choices supported community values and cultural preservation. Richard often accompanied these market visits, finding genuine pleasure in conversations with farmers and artisan food producers who valued quality over quantity, craftsmanship over mass production, community relationships over anonymous transactions. These interactions reminded him of satisfaction that came from supporting excellence regardless of its scale or commercial recognition. But perhaps the most significant change was the atmosphere that had returned to family meals themselves. Conversation flowed more easily over dishes that people actually wanted to eat. Laughter came more frequently when food provided genuine pleasure rather than mere sustenance. Gratitude was expressed naturally when meals felt like gifts rather than obligations. The kitchen had regained its status as heart of the home, not just because of cooking activities that occurred there, but because of emotional connections that were nourished through shared appreciation for artistry, that prioritized love over impression, satisfaction over sophistication, authenticity over expensive presentation. One evening in late November, as fog rolled over San Francisco Bay and the kitchen filled with aromas of roasted turkey and stuffing preparation for Thanksgiving dinner, Richard found himself watching Marlene orchestrate meal preparation with the same admiration he felt for successful business operations that ran with apparent effortlessness despite underlying complexity. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly, his voice carrying weight that made Marlene pause in her basting of the turkey. "Not just for the professional treatment, but for failing to recognize what you had been contributing to this household for years. I was measuring the wrong things, valuing the wrong qualities, making decisions based on assumptions that turned out to be completely wrong." Marlene accepted his acknowledgement with grace that reflected the same dignity she had maintained during months of systematic professional humiliation. "People see what they're ready to see," she replied gently. "Sometimes it takes time to understand the difference between what looks impressive and what actually nourishes." The conversation was interrupted by Eleanor's arrival, carrying flowers from her own garden and stories about Thanksgiving preparations from her childhood, but the exchange had accomplished its purpose. Recognition had been offered and accepted. Understanding had been reached about lessons learned through experience that no amount of money could have purchased directly. As the household prepared for Thanksgiving dinner that would feed both body and soul, as recipes connected present celebration to cultural memories spanning generations, as gratitude was expressed for abundance that couldn't be measured in cryptocurrency valuations or stock portfolio performance, the true wealth of their shared experience became apparent to everyone gathered around the table. The kitchen had taught them all something essential about recognizing authentic value, about appreciating artistry regardless of its credentials, about understanding that some forms of excellence could only be achieved through patient practice and genuine care for the people being served. Marlene Rodriguez had prevailed not through dramatic confrontation or professional retaliation, but through the quiet persistence of creating excellence that could not be ignored indefinitely by people who consumed it daily. Her victory was measured in satisfied smiles, requests for recipe sharing, and the restoration of warmth to a household that had temporarily forgotten how to taste the love in their food. And as the fog lifted outside the penthouse windows, revealing the city spread below like a glittering feast of possibilities, the aroma of perfectly seasoned gratitude filled the air, reminding everyone present that home was not a location or a building, but wherever food was prepared with care by hands that understood the true meaning of nourishment. Have you ever found yourself cooking for people who forgot to notice the love you put into their meals? Have you ever felt invisible while providing daily care that others took for granted? Tell me in the comments below. Your story matters, and your unseen artistry deserves recognition. If Marlene's journey touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe so we can share more stories about the quiet heroes who nourish the world with their hands and hearts. For additional inspiring content, click the podcast link on the left. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey through the kitchen of the human heart. We'll see you in our next story, where love always finds a way to be tasted, even when it's temporarily forgotten.